Hello, my favourite nerds, and welcome back. Let's talk about tree people. Thank you, Falcon Knight, for suggesting this topic. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you like the end results. So, let's begin. When you think about tree people, which I'm sure you do commonly, you will think about two main forms. The Ent form, created and popularised by Lord of the Rings and Tolkien, and the Flori Colossi form, which you will probably know of from the Marvel Universe, and that is more commonly referred to as Groot. There's also the trees of Cheam, as seen in Doctor Who, but they seem to fall into the Flori Colossi group, so for simplicity, let's link up those two for the rest of this video. Now, although they look visually similar, particularly if we compare the film version of the Ents rather than the book version of the Ents, then you would be forgiven for thinking that these tree people are actually a similar species. They're not. To explain how, I'm going to take you through the evolution behind them, because what we have here, ladies and gentlemen, is a very exciting case of convergent evolution. For those who in need of a reminder, convergent evolution is when two species evolve the same feature or trait, such as flight or sight, but they do so through a different process of evolution. Think the vision of cephalopods like octopus versus the eyes of mammals. If you compare the two, then they look incredibly similar, but they ended up looking this way through convergent evolution, i.e. they separately evolved to look very similar. Side note, there is some contention about whether cephalopod eyes are actually convergent evolution or if they came about through parallel evolution, but that's besides the point of this video. We're talking specifically about the convergent evolution of Ents and the Flori Colossi. That's not something I ever thought I would say. Now, granted, Tolkien expressly says that the Ents were made by Yavanna as a way of her balancing out the nature-ravaging nature of the dwarves, which her spouse created. Assuming that's true, there's no mention that I've found about the evolutionary origins of the Flori Colossi. So why do I think that these two species arose through a process of convergent evolution? Because the alternative is that they shared a common ancestor and have since diverged evolutionarily. Now, the main reason I don't believe this is what happened is because we would need to see evidence, first of all, of Lord of the Rings being a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe or the Doctor Who universe. And considering the issues they had bringing X-Men back into the fold, I just think Marvel lawyers would veto this possible union before it could even get started. But I'm getting distracted. On to a biological reason of why I don't believe this happened. Unless we're saying that the Entwives developed space travel when they left Treebird and the other male Ents, in which case Treebird is definitely never going to find them, and that some of the female Ents were pregnant and had baby male Ents who did their duty and propagated the Ent race with the older cougar female Ents, then it's probably unlikely that these two species ever crossed paths. The main reason I think this is because, without being speciesist, Ent space travel just seems very far-fetched. I know that their incredibly long lives mean they've plenty of time to accomplish this, but Tolkien made it very clear that the culture of the Ents is opposed to industrialization. Unless you had a very twisted, mass-murdering Ent who harboured no misgivings about using wood as a source of fuel, then it's hard to see how the Ents would cross some of the main barriers to industrialization, especially when it comes to progressing to a point where society can make space travel possible. Plus, they are extra prone to workplace accidents with how flammable they are, so I just don't see this happening. Now, of course, there is nothing to prevent another species having developed space travel and the Ents being taken along for a ride. But I also sadly don't think the Ents would survive long enough for that. Tolkien hinted quite strongly that cultures like the Ents can't survive in an industrializing world. So yeah, bye-bye Ents. So since the Ents and the Flori Colossi are genetically unrelated, we have two similar species therefore that arose in very different ways, which isn't at all that surprising when you delve into the biology of these two species. To do this, let's start out by comparing the physical traits of the two. Common features of both species include their height. The name Ent even comes from the Anglo-Saxon for giant. Another feature they share is their strength, but this is hardly surprising considering their size and the fact that they are made out of plant matter. You know, the stuff we've chopped down over the years and used to build our houses. What is surprising about the tree people, however, is that they have the ability to move, especially at the speed that they do move. Although plant matter can shift about, it can only do so slowly. This means that the biological makeup of these creatures isn't what we've seen in nature. We see Groot in particular doing some shape-changey, level, fast-growing mojo stuff, which, while cool, isn't realistic. We already discussed the limitations of shape changing in the incubi and succubi evolution video in terms of the ability to produce new cells and the limitation thereof, but it would be incredibly labor intensive for a tree to grow new branches at the rate that Groot is doing. Just think about all the energy he's wasting. Photosynthesis, the way plants get their energy, can't provide the energy level to support such wastage. So this feature is one that I'm going to chalk up to rule of cool. It looks great, which is why I can see that filmmakers would want to include it, but it's just not really possible. So what other features are there that we need to compare? Well, there's the fact that both species seem to live for very long lives, but this is hardly surprising considering how long trees can live for. The oldest trees on Earth are estimated to be about 5,000 years old. Specifically, I'm talking about the bristlecone pine, or Pinus longeva. One of the reasons it's thought it can reach such a great age is because of its ability to conserve energy. It even retains the needles it produces for about 30 years, minimizing the amount of energy it spends replacing them. So this is another reason against the whole Flori Colossi vine growing thing. Side point, if you follow the logic of the Flori Colossi expending huge amounts of energy when it does grow vines, then this would mean that Groot's creating that protective cage about the other guardians to keep them safe was what got him killed, not the impact of the cage hitting the ground. He depleted his body using everything he had to protect his friends. And it kind of adds a whole other level to the scene when you think about it like that, no? Moving on, we're now going to examine a feature that truly separates the Flori Colossi from the Ents, and adds a lot of weight to the whole convergent evolution theory. To look at the tree people species, they look quite similar, no? Well, this is primarily because of some artistic licenses taken by the film creators when it comes to the Ents. In the book, they're actually much more humanoid in nature. Tolkien describes them as even having skin that's visible on their arms and legs, their skin being smooth rather than bark-like. This more human-looking humanoid is how the Ents start out. Over time though, as they age, their skin starts to resemble bark. So how can we account for this change to their skin? Ever heard of a condition known as epidermodysplasia verruciformis? This is where people develop a bark-like substance that resembles an elderly Ent's skin, and could account for this feature. Although it also often develops into a form of skin cancer, so we might have a lot of dead Ents if this is what's happening to them. Then again, a lot of cancer treatments were initially discovered and refined from the chemicals in tree, like aspirin from willow bark, and yew trees led to the development of a certain type of chemotherapy. So maybe Ents have a fantastic medicinal library based on the information that they have from the forest, which would probably be essential. Tolkien never talks about cancer in Lord of the Rings that I know of, but the main reason cancer occurs is because of aging. The cells in our body go wrong over time. So considering how long the Ents live for, you've got to assume that they knew something we don't. Side note, I used to work for a cancer charity, and we would be forever getting people writing in with conspiracies about people hiding the cure for cancer. Cuba's hiding the cure, the government's hiding the cure, pharmaceutical companies are hiding the cure. Nobody ever worried about the Ents though. So, epidermodysplasia verruciformis is a way to explain, potentially, how the Ents become more tree-like over time. But there is another way that we can explain this feature. One that can also explain why the Ents end up resembling the types of trees that they care for. And it's the one I prefer, if only because it doesn't involve a potentially horrific disease that can cause no end of problems for the person with it. So what is this other way that the Ents undergo this process of incremental chameleonism? That would be epigenetic change. Epigenetics is when our environment or behavior affects what our DNA does. Our DNA stays the same, but our bodies act differently. It's where nature and nurture merge together. For example, the nutrition a developing fetus in the womb gets will greatly affect the physical features of the child later in life. So how could epigenetics explain the Ents taking on different physical forms depending on the types of trees that they care for? Well, there could be any number of mechanisms involved, but the simplest would be a process linked to the pollen released by the trees. Trees all produce different forms of pollen. This is why people who have allergies to tree pollen onset at different times of the year. You can actually figure out what type of pollen is triggering your allergy by mapping out when the hay fever onsets and when it stops against when trees are releasing their pollen. The why behind this is because pollen has antigens on its surface, small molecules that identify the pollen as being pollen. And when they are detected by our immune system, it allows our immune system to recognize the pollen as being foreign to our bodies, which, in the case of those of us with overactive immune systems, results in an allergic reaction caused by the immune system launching an unnecessary war on the pollen. So spending time around, say, a lot of birch trees and a lot of birch pollen would mean that the ant is exposed to a lot of this birch pollen, which in turn would be detected by their body. And it's possible that the immune reactions it's triggered could be linked to an epigenetic change that results in the ant slowly taking on the physical appearance of the birch tree. If this was happening, then it would be incredibly cool. It's a real shame that ants are fantasy creatures, because the scientist in me would love to get my hands on some samples. It's probably for the best that they don't exist then. Now, how does this process we've just described for the ants compare to the Flori Colossi? Well, the Flori Colossi always looks like a tree. As confirmed by our favourite dancing twig, you're just so adorable. That we know of, the Flori Colossi doesn't respond to its environment in that way. So this is another reason why these two species are very likely unrelated. But there is one more nail I have to hammer into that coffin. And that's that, based on what we know about their method of reproduction, more on that one in a moment, the Flori Colossi appears to be a sentient flora, rather than a type of fauna as the ant is, which, evolutionary speaking, would be fascinating. For a plant to gain sentience and easy mobility, that's no mean feat, and we've certainly never seen anything like it in the real world. I'm not even going to speculate on what the type of nervous system of these creatures would have to be, or how they would be able to be sentient, because I really can't. It would be like trying to artificially create a new form of life, which I just don't have time for at present. But why do I consider the Flori Colossi's method of reproduction to be so important when it comes to the differences between these two species? Well, that's because the ant is a gendered species. Treebird and the other ants of Fanghorn are male, while the antwives are female. This is different from trees in general, which are both male and female. They have both sexual organs, which, by the way, would mean that Groot is likely both male and female if we're going down the logical path of the Flori Colossi being evolved from a sentient flora species. Ants, meanwhile, are likely to reproduce in the mammalian way, with the baby ant being incubated inside one of the antwives for a gestation period lasting who knows how long, considering their overall lifespans. They could be pregnant for years. It's probably why they left. They were like, no, to hell with it, no more. So we've reached the end of our analysis of the tree people species. And as always, it's time to rate them on our scale of plausibility. Since the Flori Colossi version has taken quite a few liberties biology-wise, and the ants were made by a magical process that we don't know too much about, this is a bit of a tricky one. But I'm going to be fair and I'm going to judge them separately, since after spending the whole video arguing the point of convergent evolution, they really shouldn't be thrown into the same category now. For the ants, biologically speaking, there is a lot about the species that could be plausible. Certainly more so than some of the species we've seen so far. I'm going to put them about on a par with vampires, so they don't quite beat out the sex demons for top of the leaderboard, but they've made a good attempt. As for the Flori Colossi, well, until someone shows me a sentient plant species, preferably not one set on consuming the entire human race, then I'm not going to argue for the plausibility of this species. They are moving about all over the show, wasting resources like crazy, and I don't buy it. Disagree with me? Well then do so in the chat, and let me know what species you want to see next time. Have a great week, my nerds. Bye!